Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I'd like to review The Long Dark. I'd heard a lot of praise for it in the past, but I never understood what the appeal was. The stylized graphics seem to suggest a simple gameplay. There's a semi-realistic style in terms of the textures, but a somewhat cartoonish look to the geometry of the objects. The premise sounded like yet another survival game. But I tried it on stream and I ended up playing it quite a bit on the two highest difficulties. Let's just say that there's a reason why it has such a hardcore fandom, and I hope that this complete review will shed some light on why that's the case. The Long Dark is a game set in Great Bear, a fictional island off far northern Canada, so you can immediately tell that the primary element you'll be surviving against is the cold. The premise of the game is that the world is being subjected to unusual geomagnetic storms that have disabled all forms of electronic equipment.
Power's gone. Whole electrical system looks fried.
There's no electricity, vehicles don't work, and Reddies are dead.
Can you... Damn it! No! Damn it!
The population is cut off from help and must fend for itself. The game has two modes, Survival Sandbox and Story Mode. Survival Sandbox simply drops you off in the wilderness and says, "Here, try to survive. There's nobody left alive and you must fend for yourself by scavenging and crafting tools and clothing." In lower difficulties, you'll find plenty of food and tools, including guns to protect you from the predators and to hunt animals for meat. But as you increase the difficulty, resources you can scavenge will become scarcer and scarcer, to the point where in the highest difficulty, called Interloper, the only way to get most tools and any weapons is to forge them yourself, and you must craft clothing from animal pelts in order to survive the cold. You have a variety of skills in things like starting fires, which are critical to fending off the cold, harvesting animals, and using weapons. These skills improve by doing the tasks in question, so things become easier the longer you can survive. The gameplay in Story Mode is based on the Survival Sandbox, but there are some individuals that are still alive.
Well, another stranger.
Instead of allowing the player to do anything they want, good or bad, it guides players via mandatory and optional quests. These teach the player about various aspects of the game. Hey, that is everything. That is everything. That is literally everything, yes. And give useful rewards. I believe that this is a reward. Decent Mackinac jacket. I won't be discussing the plot because it's not critical to the experience, but most quests are there to teach the player about the game mechanics. So I'd recommend first time players start playing the game on Story Mode first and then move on to Survival Mode. Though you should familiarize yourself with the very basics, because I went into the game completely blind and didn't even know how to make water. Can I please get a bit of drink?
Need water.
Yeah, can I get water out of this? But regardless, you learn, eventually. No, cannot break that. The world in The Long Dark is divided into distinct regions that link to each other, sometimes directly and sometimes by transition zones like caves. With the recent release of the Black Rock region, there are now 12 main regions. The overall size of the map was documented as being 25 square kilometers in 2015, but since then, the number of regions has been more than doubled, so the size is probably closer to 50 square kilometers. For reference, Skyrim's map is said to be around 37 square kilometers, so the world is pretty big. Generally, these regions are snowy wilderness areas, with buildings and other unique landmarks dotted about. You should expect lots of forested areas populated with deer and rabbits you can hunt, plus an occasional moose roaming between regions, and wolves and bears that will hunt you. The majority of loot will be found around these landmarks, though there will also be loot scattered around the open areas. But each region will also have its own distinct environmental signature, and no map is like another. The coastal regions feature frozen seas that allow you to see far into the distance, so it's easier to keep an eye on predators, but you'll be more exposed to the wind. The regions deeper inland will feature elevation changes and maze-like features that will make traveling and navigation more challenging. Some areas will tend to be colder than others, and some will have unique enemies in the form of timberwolf packs. It's not unusual to be able to recognize the region just from the way it looks. It's also not uncommon for players to have their own preferred regions. Some like the relatively mild and open regions like Mystery Lake and Coastal Highway. Some will like the craggy heights of Ash Canyon or Timberwolf Mountain. But nobody in the right mind likes Pleasant Valley, because pleasant it isn't. Jokes aside, each region offers different advantages and disadvantages stemming from their own features and those of nearby regions. The entire world is open to you from the beginning, sometimes with requirements like mountaineering ropes that you have to deploy, but nothing is completely inaccessible. Aside from predators, the main challenge is the cold temperature and variable weather. Of course, you have the standard survival mechanics. You get hungry, thirsty and tired. There's a variety of conditions that you can get, either from exposure to the elements, like hypothermia, or from being attacked by animals, like bleeding. There's also illnesses related to eating raw or spoiled food. I think you can only get poisoned once, and you can only get parasites once, so... Rotten wolf meat, here we go. What are you gonna do, game? Poison me twice? Basically trying...
What a way to die. I just want to die.
Okay, so I got it again, but it doesn't matter, lol. But there's also specific systems that are unique to the Long Dark. For instance, there's a variable temperature system, with the early morning being coldest and warming up across the day until it hits the warmest time, sunset, then cooling in the evening until you once again reach early morning. If you're aware of this, you can time your longer trips to take place in the afternoon to take advantage of the warmer temperature. The game will also give visual clues about the potential weather. Blizzards are often preceded by heavier snowfall, though it's not unusual for a clear sky to turn grey at the drop of a hat. Wind direction also matters, because strong winds can blow out fires, and wind chill affects your overall temperature. If you pay attention to staying protected from the wind, it can have a significant impact in keeping warm. Avoiding strong winds also reduces the wear and tear on your clothing, especially during blizzards. Snowy weather will cause footsteps in the snow to disappear faster. Foggy days will decrease your visibility, and windy weather will mean more sticks spawn on the ground. There's little touches that make sense all around. But it's also obvious that you can only act within the framework that the designers had in mind. You gather birch bark from the ground to make healing teas, but can't directly harvest bark from those trees. You can harvest sticks and wood on the ground, but you can't harvest directly from the trees. You can gather coal that's scattered in mines, but you can't actually mine coal. You can harvest wood from planks and crates, but not from breaking down drawers or ruined houses. This makes more sense once you understand that the game is focused on scavenging, but I'll cover that in more depth later. You also share the world with animals. Generally, both prey animals and predators behave in a predictable manner, and once you understand the behavior of each animal, there's not much challenge to it. Rabbits and deer will flee from you, while wolves and bears will stalk you and charge once they get within a certain range. You can easily keep wolves at bay if you carry a torch or light a flare. On the other hand, bears are not afraid of fire, but they're slow enough that you can easily avoid them. There are glitches in their behavior, but generally the biggest risk is if you happen to stumble on them. Say if you crest a hill and there's a wolf just beyond it, or if you're walking through an area with trees and fail to see a wolf. The player shouldn't expect complex behavior, and in some cases it doesn't make much sense. For example, if you aim a weapon at wolves, they'll usually charge. But if you do that after they've hunted something, they'll flee, which doesn't make much sense. Once you maximize your cooking skill, you'll be able to eat predators, but that only happens quite far into the game, so it's best to keep in mind that they're intended to be hazards to be avoided rather than tackled head on. But there's also the auroras that caused all this. If one occurs, it'll power all the electrical circuits in the game, which leads to electrical lighting turning on in indoor areas. but there's also electrical hazards from exposed cables.
Ow! Hot! 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 Ah, that hurts so much.
They also lead to some very visually appealing vistas, as the northern lights ripple across the sky. They also make animals tougher to kill and better at detecting you. It's dangerous to be out during these times, because tangling with an aurora wolf or bear is likely to lead to the end of your run.
My fingers feel numb.
What stands out once you do play The Long Dark is that the gameplay is primarily focused on scavenging. This is different from most survival focused games in that you might start scavenging, but eventually gameplay will move on from that as you become able to construct a base with facilities that allow you to take care of your basic needs in a more automated fashion. Let's consider food. At first you might have to manually harvest wild food, but you'd eventually be able to construct plots or gardens that allow you to have a steady supply of food without scavenging. Typically you'd have a central location that you base yourself out of. That's not how The Long Dark is designed, and this becomes more apparent as you increase the difficulty. Early on you can scavenge buildings for things like canned foods and medicine, or harvest equivalent wild plants like cattails for food and various medicinal teas. But there's a set limit to how many harvestable plants there are in the world, and they do not renew. You also can't construct some kind of farm or garden to give yourself a renewable supply. Animals can be hunted for meat, and will renew indefinitely, but on harder difficulties, the numbers decrease, so chances are you won't be able to feed yourself just from the animals in one location. Many goods across the world will also degrade over time, so you eventually have to find them, or they'll be useless to you. Basically, every mechanic in The Long Dark is centered around encouraging the player to move around and explore to both find loot and sustain themselves. The game even has a specific illness, cabin fever, that you can get by staying indoors too long. The game just doesn't want you to camp in the same spot. There are crafting mechanics, but they only apply to getting some tools, including a bow for hunting and defense, and some forms of clothing. I stress the word some, because you can't craft everything, and even craftable items rely on the player scavenging. In the lower difficulties, you'll be able to scavenge everything, but on the highest difficulty, you'll need to forge metal tools in order to craft the better items of clothing, and for that you'll need a hammer and a hacksaw.
Oh, lucky day.
These two can only be found somewhere in the world by scavenging. While The Long Dark's gameplay is highly focused on scavenging, it's also true that The Long Dark is very good at its implementation of scavenging. One of its greatest strengths is that it rewards observant players. First-time players might be led to believe by the relatively simple graphics that the gameplay is also relatively simple, but that could not be further from the truth when it comes to scavenging, because the game can be downright devious in where the loot might be hidden.
I'll take it.
Containers like cupboards and toolboxes have distinct drawers that are separate containers in their own right. Cars have glove boxes, but you can also check the visors. Maybe someday the developers will add something useful there. The game doesn't highlight any items, so you have to spot them yourself, and you have to put the pointer exactly over the item. It might sound simple, but some items are very small and can blend into the background.
Well, this stuff will come in handy.
It's entirely possible to miss items that you're looking at, and it takes some practice to get the gist of it. Sometimes they're in the most unexpected of places, and many are not in plain sight. They can be hidden under or over other objects like beds or cabinets.
Perfect.
They might be amongst other items that are not collectible. They might be hidden behind other objects and only visible when looked at alternate angles. There's a cannon down there. I see you. They can be inside destructible items. Sometimes you might only see a single pixel sticking out. This can happen because the loot is placed manually by the developers, so it can be hidden in ways that a random generator would have trouble replicating. But the negative side of manually placing items is that it runs the risk of players memorizing the location of loot and decreasing the joy of discovery when looting. The way the game tries to avoid this scenario is by having 4 loot tables. Each new game randomly selects the loot table when you first spawn and places items accordingly. It's still possible to catalog these loot tables, and spreadsheets do exist, But many people deliberately avoid looking things up in order to keep the scavenging experience interesting. In lower difficulties, the world is relatively mild, and once you scavenge enough warm clothes, the temperature is fairly easily manageable as long as you're mindful of the game's systems. Blizzards become the main danger as they drastically drop the temperature and destroy any visibility you might have. The only saving grace is that the blizzards will usually cause predators to despawn. So ironically, there are situations where it's safer to travel during a blizzard. But otherwise, the conditions aren't too dangerous and it's not too challenging to stay safe. As the difficulty increases however, conditions will become frostier. To the point where at the highest difficulty, the temperature will drop by 25 degrees Celsius over the first 50 days of your save. Not only that, the best lootable clothing will not spawn on Interloper, so crafting clothing to keep warm is now mandatory rather than optional. But even then, most of the time the world will still be too cold to stay outdoors without warming up regularly. The warming up effects of tea and coal become key to survival when traveling. Blizzards will also happen progressively more often, and wind direction changes more radically, so keeping a fire going is far more difficult. The decay rate of loot in the world increases to the point where there's every chance the run will become untenable unless you explicitly focus on reaching all major sources of loot before they're ruined. Player choice narrows, and it becomes a matter of following a set checklist. You must scavenge in order to find a hammer and a hacksaw.
Oh, lucky day.
You must use those to craft improvised tools and arrowheads at a forge. That's because weapons and tools are removed on Interloper, and the only way to get them is to forge. You must craft a bow and arrows and hunt predators for their pelts. You must use your improvised tools to craft warmer clothing. At a high level, all Interloper runs will follow that approach. People tend to follow routes optimized to getting those tasks accomplished because the game's difficulty assumes that you know the map layouts, where the key loot locations are, and the best routes to get there. In a way, it has similarities to speedrunning. As an aside, it's apparent that the game design assumed that you'll use health as a buffer in order to save resources. Say you're traveling between safe locations. Most of the time it's a good bargain to accept some health damage from the cold in order to avoid using matches. That happens because many resources are limited but health is renewable. Even at the highest difficulty, a few days of good sleep is enough to recover most of your health. So even though it seems counterintuitive, expending health is often a good decision. An explicit use of this fact is the starving strategy, where you accept the damage from starving all day and only eat enough food to recover as much health as possible while sleeping. Going hungry causes you a small amount of health damage, but you recover more than that if you get a good night's sleep, and the food saved is quite significant. You can choose between the various difficulty levels, or even customize your own in order to tailor the game to what you want to do. If you just want to wander around, enjoying the snowy vistas and exploring, then you can disable predators and make the world a nice, warm, welcoming place. Or if you want to test your knowledge of the game against the elements, you can choose the highest difficulty, or even choose custom difficulties that are even more difficult than that. One of the ones that the more experienced streamers play is called No One Gets Out Alive, or No Goa for short, and disables healing altogether. Or you can choose to play Gun Loper, which is Interloper but with guns enabled, for a more action-packed style. Ultimately, you can adjust the difficulty to suit your desired experience. One thing that is annoying is that sometimes the prompts to interact with objects are either not in the correct places, or they take a while to come up. This is not normally an issue when you're not under time pressure. But quite often, they can make the difference between being able to do what you want and not being able to. Come on, pick it up! Pick up the bunny! Oh, bloody hell, game! Something similar exists with some animations, because quite often they're long and uninterruptible. That can cause quite a lot of anxiety when you're in a situation that demands quick response. For instance, the drawing animation on the bow is very slow and makes it disruptive to have the bow out while picking up things. Similarly, the loading animation for guns involves reloading the entire magazine before you can fire. This can involve up to 10 bullets, and when you're about to get jumped by a wolf or a bear, you often want to fire before you fully reload it. This is primarily due to the game design not being focused on action, so it's something to keep in mind. Eventually, you'll have discovered and looted all the locations in all the regions. By this stage, you should have all the tools you need and probably have enough stores to keep your needs satisfied. So what's left to do? Unfortunately, this is also where the game's strong focus on scavenging starts to become a negative, because you run out of clear goals for you to strive towards. You still have to do maintenance activities, like making sure you have enough food and water available to sustain yourself. You have to keep your clothing and gear repaired. But it's very likely that none of these present a challenge anymore, and it's now up to you to decide how to keep the game fun. You might spend a lot of time fishing, because that's one activity you don't normally do often before you've looted the world. You might also spend a lot of time reading books to try and get your skills to max levels. Or map the world. Some people decide to craft a lot of bullets even if they don't have guns. Or maybe spend some time arranging your loot just to show off. Based on one person's 15-year run, it's evident that you can play indefinitely if you want.
First, I'll tell you that based on first-hand experience, you can comfortably survive 14 years and change. That's just first-hand.
Some resources, like matches to start fires, are finite, though there are ways to work around these limits. Typically it involves scavenging around the edge of the frozen sea for loot that's washed up and saving you cooking for days when you can use your magnifying lens to start a fire for free. But it's very true that the choices of what to do narrow down significantly once you finish scavenging the world. The challenge also drops off as your skills increase. Early on, starting fires and repairing gear is prone to fail. Harvesting meat will be much easier, and your weapons will be more effective the higher you level your skills. Basically, you can do things both faster and with less risk of failure. It's worth making a special comment on cooking though. Eating wolf and bear meat has an inherent risk of making you sick, so it's usually something you avoid eating or eating small quantities at most. But reaching max cooking level removes this risk altogether, so you can consume it just like any other meat. And each bear you kill will give you 30 to 40 kilos of meat. Comparatively, each deer gives you 7 to 10 kilos of meat, so each bear is equivalent to about 4 deer. And once you know what you're doing, bears are actually easier to hunt than deer. Only mooses are comparable, and they only appear randomly every so often, whereas you can usually find 2 or 3 bears in each map, and they'll reliably respawn after you kill them. They're arguably the most optimal source of food, so much so that it's not uncommon for late game players to focus on roaming through the world, killing them as they respawn. You end up with an excess of food, and there's an argument to be made that the benefits of maximum level cooking drastically changes the game. Overall, the challenge in the game is highest at the beginning when you're naked and have no gear. It increases as the world becomes colder, plateaus when this cooling effect stops, and decreases as your skills improve. Once your weapons stop being usable because you've exhausted all the ammunition in the world, the difficulty will spike once again as you lose access to most meat.
Come on.
But it will take a very long time to reach this final stage. So in many ways, it can feel as if the game loses challenge as you progress through your run, and it's the case that many players actually prefer to start new runs rather than keep long runs going. That's why some of the extra difficult custom modes are played. Having said that, if you've managed to survive to the point where the challenge begins to drop off, then you've done pretty well. The Long Dark is not about combat. It has its moments of tension when you're being stalked by predators, and while you can focus on finding animals, it's more optimal to use resources to avoid most predators. Predators are intended to be hazards and obstacles to be worked around rather than fought. People who enjoy traveling wilderness areas and forests will get a big kick out of this game, especially if you enjoy wintry landscapes, because walking around on a clear day while the sun is shining brightly overhead, you're nicely fed and the wind is calm is quite enjoyable. You will of course have your share of blizzards and grey cloudy skies, but that's just part of the experience. If you're someone who's good at spotting things and enjoys games that reward that, you'll enjoy the scavenging aspects because the primary skill used in looting is the player's own ability to visually spot things. There's a lot of buildings and locations to explore, and most of the sites are unique, so there's a lot of variety in the search. People who enjoy survival mechanics that challenge you will similarly enjoy the game. You can customize the exact difficulty, but there's many tricks that you'll have to learn in order to overcome the elements at higher difficulties. Overall, The Long Dark is a game focused on scavenging to survive in a harsh environment. People who enjoy the types of aspects I covered are likely to enjoy their stay in far northern Canada. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe and hit the bell button to be notified when new videos come out. See you soon.